Hi everyone, welcome back. This is episode 3 to You're Not Crazy, where we talk about some of the important things that we're all dealing with when it relates to our mental health. My name is Carrie Smith. I'm a licensed clinical social worker.
Hi everyone, this is Jaspreet Rai, licensed psychologist, and thank you again for tuning in.
So today we're going to expand more on anxiety. So our topic for this month is anxiety, and we're going to spend some time this month talking about different ways to understand anxiety, different ways to help ourselves deal with anxiety. So just want to put a disclaimer out there that we are not a replacement for treatment. So any kind of medical treatment you might need for your mental health, we definitely encourage you to seek that, whether it's therapy or medication or just an evaluation. If you feel like you're in crisis, you can call 988. It's a suicide hotline, or call 911 if you think you're having a medical or psychiatric emergency, or go to the nearest emergency room. So I want to make sure that we put that out there to you as well. So today we're going to focus on expanding on our cycle of anxiety and how to put that into practice, how to spend some time with yourself to identify and learn what the heck is going on to help you slow down that cycle of emotion. You want to get us started with some of our first steps?
Absolutely. And I think just kind of going back to what Carrie had mentioned is we want to really be a resource, but knowing that if you're dealing with something more serious, or if you're just kind of like, this is not like me, I feel very unusual or unsafe, then going back to one of those options of calling 911 or going to the nearest hospital, that is very key, because our goal here is to create awareness, but also know that we are not a crisis support, right? So, and reflecting back to our episode 2, we did talk about the cycle of anxiety, right? What does that look like? What does that feel like? And some of the visuals, like we said, vision the stop sign, right? I hope you are able to vision that red stop sign that we see as we're driving down on our roads here. So first thing as we're practicing is looking at identifying a trigger. I know we talked about this a little bit. What is a trigger? So maybe we'll take a pause and look at it, get a piece of paper, or just kind of mentally, if you're able to identify what is a trigger, right?
I want to add too, there are some times where it's hard for us to know what the trigger is. And I think it can be helpful to recognize there's always a trigger. It may not be something that I have full awareness of, but if I can't figure it out, what can be helpful is to just remind ourselves, something triggered me, right? If I can identify, yes, we want to try our best to do that. Sometimes we don't know exactly what it is in the moment. It'll come to you later. You'll figure it out.
Yeah. And one of the things that really works well, and I tell my members, is write it down. Write down that scenario right afterwards when you felt like, oh, I don't know why I feel this way, but I do. So maybe kind of replaying that scenario. And if you're still not able to pinpoint the trigger, but at least now you can move forward and focus on how you're feeling. Right? So it might be like, I don't know what the trigger is. It could be several things, or I just truly don't know, but at least you can focus on, okay, let me focus on how am I feeling regardless of what the trigger is.
Yeah. And next step is going to be identifying the thought. And so I want to remind you, the thought is different from the feeling. The thought are things like, I feel like, I think, I betcha, I wonder if. Those are thoughts, right? I feel like everybody hates me. That's a thought. That's not a feeling. So when we can start to identify our thoughts, we're going to label them as automatic negative thoughts, or ants. They're like little ants in your head, messing with you, bugging you, telling you a story that may or may not be true. Often it's not 100% true. Usually there's a little truth in it, and then there's a whole lot of interpretation, right? We take a nugget of truth and we come up with this whole story or book about what the truth is, about the world, about what people think, about what's going to happen. We predict the future. So there's all these ways that we automatically think very negatively that contribute to us feeling anxious or worried or scared, right? So that's your second step. And like Jaspreet said, get a piece of paper, write these things down, because sometimes when we get out of our head, we need to connect other senses. Writing is movement. Thinking, seeing, hearing, we're going to teach you how to say it out loud, right? So connecting all your senses helps you learn, and helps you learn something new.
Absolutely. And we will be in our episode 4 diving into a little further of what those automatic thoughts looks like. There's a full category of them, and you'll be like, oh yes, I do this and this, or I combine these two, and we all do it. Again, going back to the reason for our podcast, reason for our channel is that we want to make sure that you have this information, but also you're able to normalize it for yourself, right? So, and the next component is, what emotions are you feeling, right? So like we discussed in the last episode, sad, angry, happy, guilt, any of those things. What are these emotions that I'm feeling? And identifying those. And I will say there's been a lot of times, including myself, where I'm like, gosh, it's not this, I don't know what it is. So maybe starting with what you know it is not, sometimes that's helpful too, because there's a lot of emotions that are around, and Googling it, I think that's where it starts, is you just
Google feelings,
yes,
emotions.
yes,
There's a whole lot of information out there on the internet that can help you identify how you're feeling.
yes, and because that is the key, right, is that until it's one of those things of like, it's like a math problem. If you don't know what the problem is, how are you going to solve it, right? So that's really finding out the core of like, what are emotions am I having? I would say is, trying your best to label and identifying it, or getting close to it, right? And as you do your own research and finding out, okay, which emotions, and it could be multiple emotions, right? That's another thing too. It doesn't have to be one, it could be a variety of emotions. And going back to what we talked about, it could be a positive emotion, happiness, but we're anxious about it because it's a new opportunity, or it's something that we feel like, I've never ventured out and done this. So that's also normalizing that these emotions can be happy, positive emotions, but also can create some anxiety for you.
Yeah. And some of us, it's unusual to feel happy or excited, right? Like when we get into a new relationship or something like that, or we get a new job, or, we have some kind of positive change in our life. And so we get nervous about that emotion of being happy. And maybe it's both. Maybe we're nervous and we're happy. I'm a big fan that we can be be nervous and happy, instead of am I nervous or am I happy? You're both, right? So I focus on the both and versus the ors, right? So the next step that we want to encourage you to try practicing is to identify what your behaviors are. What are you doing to avoid in your life, right? Or in this moment even. So, again, we have a trigger, something happened, I'm having these automatic thoughts, I'm feeling some intense emotions. What am I doing, or what do I tend to do in these situations that might be a bit of a sabotage in my life? Are there things that you're avoiding? Are there things right now that you're avoiding? Are there things in general that you avoid? So we want to identify those avoidance behaviors. We want to identify, are they some maybe self-sabotage behaviors? Some examples might be drinking alcohol, avoiding exercise, which is really healthy for us, eating crappy foods, which sometimes feels good in the moment, but doesn't really help you feel better at all. It helps you feel worse, right? So sometimes those are examples of some self-sabotages as well.
And what's always, I would say, taking that a step further, right? And looking at the what ifs, playing out that scenario and situation, right? Of this is how I'm feeling because, oh, this is going to happen, right? My automatic mind saying, oh yeah, well, nothing good's going to come from this. So really playing out the what if, what is the end game here? What do I think is going to happen? And what Carrie had mentioned, the sabotage behavior. Okay, well, what's going to happen if I do engage in drinking alcohol, or I do engage in the various other things of like, okay, I'm not going to take this action because for certain this is going to happen. So really playing it out of like, okay, if this scenario is what I'm fearful of, well, what would happen if I actually went through and followed through that event, right? What would happen if I actually exercised, right? What would happen if I continue eating
I'd
unhealthy?
be a lot smaller if I exercised.
You and me both. So, and again, we're human, right? We have these conversations with ourselves, and that's where
Every
we want
day.
to. Yep, we're human, and that's where the struggle is real. But I think it's reflecting and checking in with ourselves, and I think doing it in a manner where it comes from love and self-care and compassion, and not being judgmental. I think that's another thing too, because when we're having that sabotage conversation, we're already kind of being harsh, and we can be our worst enemies. But coming with care and compassion and with love of like, okay, I'm going to start over, and I'm just really going to reflect on doing something different, which might feel anxious in itself because you're used to self-sabotage.
Yeah. So just to wrap this up, one of the things to also maybe put a label to in a way that has compassion behind it is, what are the short-term benefits of what you're doing versus the long-term benefits. So a lot of times the short-term benefit when we're feeling anxious is to avoid, and in the moment that feels good, or to engage in a behavior that isn't really helpful, and in the moment it feels good. But the long term is that your anxiety gets bigger and bigger and your world gets smaller and smaller. And if we face some of these fears and we start doing things differently, because we're going to respond to our thoughts and our emotions differently, then our world starts to get a little bit bigger, and long term we get better and we feel more confident in managing our anxiety. So really look at what are the costs short term and what are the costs long term. So that's all for today.
Yay,
We don't want to take
yes.
up too much time. We want these to be pretty short videos for you. And so tune in with us next week where we expand more on those automatic thoughts and ways that we can manage those thoughts. So
All right. Well, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Bye, everyone.